Hello and welcome. We're glad you're viewing our gardening video today. It was created as a companion resource to our Gardening with the MGs, a series of talks presented at local libraries by the Walton County Master Gardener Extension volunteers. Our video today is in our fall gardening series, and it's called Plant Fall Bulbs for Spring Flowers. Let's get digging. I'm sure there are many bulbs that you are acquainted with. But let's talk about a few today. Daffodils were brought to Britain by Romans who thought that the sap from daffodils had healing powers. However, we've since learned that the sap actually contains crystals that can irritate the skin. Do you know about hyacinths? They came to Europe from Turkey in the year 1573. By the early 1700s, hyacinths were very popular, as there were more than 2,000 cultivars available. How about crocuses? Crocuses were brought to England from France, and then to the United States on ships by English settlers. And of course, there are tulips. Tulips were originally cultivated in the Ottoman Empire, today's Turkey, and then imported into Holland in the 16th century. By the mid-17th century, tulips were so popular that they created the very first economic bubble, which was known as tulip mania. People bought up tulips until they became so expensive that they were used as money, and then the market in them crashed. So just what is a bulb? Most of the time when we say the word bulb, we mean any plant that stores its complete life cycle in an underground storage structure. The primary purpose of these storage structures is to ensure the plant's survival during adverse weather conditions. Bulbs can be broken down into 5 types of storage structures, as our picture shows. There are true bulbs, corms, tubers, tuberous roots and stems, and rhizomes. And because there is one other storage structure that behaves as a bulb, we'll also talk about fleshy roots in this video. Now let's dig a little deeper into our definition of the parts of the true bulb. There are 5 major parts, as you see in the picture. There's the basal plate. That's the bottom of the bulb from which the roots grow. There are the fleshy scales. These are the primary storage tissues. There's the tunic, or the tunica, which is the skin-like covering that protects the fleshy scales. There's the shoot, that consists of the developing flower and the leaf buds. And then there are lateral buds. These develop into bulblets or offsets. Again, there are 2 types of bulbs. One is known as the tunicate or the laminate, and it has a paper-like covering or tunic that protects the scales from drying and from mechanical injury. You're familiar with many of these bulbs, which include tulips, daffodils, hyacinths, grape hyacinths, and alliums. Then there's the non-tunicate, or the imbricate bulbs. These do not have the tunic, remember that's the paper covering, to protect the fleshy scales. An example of this type of bulb is the lily. New bulbs, called bulblets, form around the base of the original bulb. These are often called offsets, and they are used to produce new plants. Bulbils develop in the leaf axis of the plants, such as the lily, as you see there in the picture. Remember, it takes more than 1 year for the bulbils or the bulblets to become flower size. and when bulbs become overcrowded, you will notice that the flowers begin to diminish in both size and number. That's a good indicator that it's time to dig up and divide those bulbs. Have you ever wondered about the difference between the words daffodil, narcissus, and jonquil? Well, much confusion has existed over the proper name for these plants, and many times they are used interchangeably. The narcissus is the generic botanical name that was given to these bulbs in 1753. In England, the plants were commonly known as daffodils. And because they were carried to other countries by English-speaking people, daffodils was a name that stuck. Jonquil actually refers to a specific kind of a narcissus and is not correct for the group in general. True jonquils have a reed-like leaf and very sweet-smelling flowers. So narcissus is the correct botanical name for the genus. Daffodil is the correct common name for all members of the genus, and jonquil refers to one particular division of the genus. Let's talk about one of the bulb-like structures, the corm. A corm is the swollen base of a stem axis enclosed by dry, scale-like leaves. It is a solid stem structure with distinct nodes and internodes, and it does not have visible storage rings when cut in half. This is what distinguishes a corm from a true bulb. The corm contains a basal plate, that's the bottom of the bulb from which the roots develop, a thin tunic, and a growing point. Maybe you've noticed pea-sized structures at the base of a corm. These are called cormels, and those will be new plants that can be saved and replanted. Examples of plants that develop from corms include the gladiolus, in the picture above, and the crocus. When gladiolus corms are dug in the fall, they should be separated into well-developed corms, which will be stored for replanting, and poorly developed corms that you may want to discard. The picture above shows you a well-developed corm. Remember, those are the ones that you want to save. A tuber is a modified stem structure that develops on underground stems. Some examples include caladiums, oxalis, anemones, and the Irish potato. You might be surprised to learn that the Irish potato does flower. The tuber differs from a true bulb and corm by not having a basal plate, from which the roots develop, and by not having a protective tunic covering. Tuberous roots and stems differ from bulb-like structures in that the nutrient reserves are stored in an actual root or an enlarged stem tissue at the soil surface. Some examples of tuberous stems include tuberous begonia and gloxinia. The tuberous begonia produces from buds on top of the round, flat tuber. Examples of tuberous roots include the dahlia and the sweet potato. The dahlia reproduces from buds at the top end of the root or at the base of the stem, as shown in the picture. The tuberous root of the dahlia, when it is divided, should not be divided before placing in storage in the fall, but should be divided at planting time. The root should be divided into sections with an eye-bearing portion of the stem left with each section of the root. You might be interested to know that a sweet potato is a member of the morning glory family. Rhizomes are other bulb-like structures, but they differ by growing horizontally under the surface of the soil. They bear the same internal and external structure as true stems. You may know some examples of rhizomes in iris, there in the picture, canna, and lily of the valley. The lily of the valley rhizome spreads horizontally underground and produces pips, which develop into the new plants. This plant is increasing the landscape by digging in the fall, removing the pips with the developed roots for replanting. Please know, lily of the valley can be considered invasive. Finally, the sixth category that we added to the bulb-like structure, called fleshy roots, has been added to this video because they are divided and replanted in the fall, like the others we've discussed. Some examples in this category of fleshy roots include daylilies and peonies. The daylily has a fleshy root system, with some varieties having what might be considered almost a rhizome type root system. Daylilies are hardy herbaceous plants with perennial growth habits. They have clumps of rich green smooth foliage that dies back during the winter. Both peonies and daylilies are propagated by dividing in the fall, and you'll want to root clumps of peonies, as shown in the picture, with at least 3 crown buds with each clump. Daylilies can be divided in the fall or the spring into the plantlets with a single fan of leaves, as shown in the picture. The majority of bulbous plants are actually less particular about the site where they are planted than most other cultivated plants, but we still do have to consider the site selection and the preparation of the soil. Select a site by considering the following. Spring flowering bulbs prefer light shade to full sun. They bloom before most trees or shrubs leaf out, so you can successfully plant these bulbs under trees and shrubs. Spring bulbs planted on the south slope or the south side of a house will bloom earlier than the same bulbs that are planted on the north slope. And bulbs planted on a hillside will bloom earlier than bulbs planted in a valley. Remember, before you plant, test your soil. You can get soil test kits at your local county extension office. Why would you want to test your soil? Bulbs prefer a pH range of 6.0 to 6.8. And fall is the perfect time to add lime if the soil test indicates a need. The majority of the bulbous plants we've been discussing are actually less particular about the soil than many other cultivated plants, but they do prefer a medium sandy loam. Good soil drainage is essential, so if you have heavy clay soils like most of us here in Georgia do, consider adding compost, composted leaves, peat moss, or another source of organic materials. If your soil test results indicated that you need to add lime, fertilizer, or any other soil amendments, incorporate those into the top 12 to 18 inches of soil. Fall is a great time to do this. In the absence of a soil test, you can safely add 1 to 2 pounds of a fertilizer that's rated at 5-10-10 per 100 square feet. That second number represents phosphorus, and it is the most important as it helps develop good root systems. Bone meal used to be recommended, but current meat processing procedures have reduced the amount of phosphorus that is available for plants. Phosphorus needs to be added to the planting hole and worked into the surrounding soil rather than just sprinkled on top. When you're selecting bulbs to plant, you have 3 sources for obtaining bulbs: through mail order, local garden centers, and discount or big box stores. In selecting your bulbs to plant, think about your existing color palette. What color is your house? There are other plants that will be flowering in the garden at the same time? Then think about those colors. And what foliage colors will be around the bulbs? Remember, consider the height at flowering when you are planting your bulbs. You don't want to plant a daffodil that grows to 36 inches in front of a crocus that only grows to about 6 inches. When thinking about bulbs to select for planting, remember the larger the bulb, the higher the grade, and that usually means larger flowers. Bulbs should be firm and have unblemished skin, and you do want to avoid any bulbs that are soft or discolored. When you're thinking about the number of bulbs to select to plant, think in terms of odd numbers. You'll want to plant in large drifts of 11 to 15 bulbs of the same variety. Also, bulbs are known to bloom in early season, mid-season, or late season. If you want to have a continuous wave of color, plant all three varieties, an early, mid, and a late season variety. You might want to consider making combinations of bulbs. Tulips, daffodils, hyacinths, and crocus will create a riot of spring color and bloom. Remember, however, that in our zone 8A, tulips do not always come back the second year, and they're not as reliable. But they are beautiful. When you're thinking about your bulbs to plant this fall to get your spring flowers, think in terms of what bulbs will bloom in the early spring. Here's a list of some that are recommended for our area. If you want 1 to 4 weeks of bloom in the early spring, plant snowdrop, winter aconite, Danford iris, crocus, and others that are listed in this list, including the early daffodils. There's a picture of the snowdrop. Then if you want to have bulbs blooming in mid-spring for about 4 to 8 weeks, take a look at this list to make your selection, especially the hyacinths and the smaller or medium cup daffodils. And then for the last part of spring, the last 8 to 12 weeks, here's a list of bulbs that you might want to consider planting this fall for that late spring color. Dutch iris, your tulips from mid-season through late season, and your daffodils, especially the late season varieties. Another bulb you may not have considered is the allium, and they come in beautiful purples and whites and even some light pinks. When planting your spring flowering bulbs in this area of Georgia, you'll want to think about planting them October through late December, as long as the ground is not frozen. Most bulbs require a 12 to 16 week of a cold period, and this can be accomplished by being in ventilated packaging in the bottom of a refrigerator for 40 to 50 degrees. But remember, do not store your bulbs with fruit, especially apples. The planting depth is very important. Think in terms of 2 to 3 times the greatest diameter for the bulbs that are 2 inches or more, and a depth of 3 to 4 times the greatest diameter for the smaller bulbs. The chart on the right shows you a good idea of where different bulbs that we have talked about would be planted. As you can see, you would want to plant the lily and the largest of your narcissus or daffodils between the 8 and 10 inch range, where your hyacinths will be around 2 inch and your iris rhizomes will be almost at soil level. The spacing will vary. You'll want to plant bulbs and corms upright, but think in terms of planting rhizomes and tuberous roots on the sides. Then after planting, water the bed well in order to settle the soil. Caring and maintaining bulbs is really very easy. Once you've prepared the bed, your bulbs will require little cultivation except some periodic weeding, and that you can do by hand because you'll want to avoid digging too deeply. Be sure to cover any bed of bulbs that you have with 2 to 3 inches of mulch. Mulch helps minimize temperature fluctuation and ensures winter survival of the bulbs. Mulching also helps to maintain an optimal moisture level in your planting bed. However, if you're thinking in terms of small, early blooming bulbs, you might not want to mulch those too thickly. Your mulch can consist of pine needles, wood chips, shredded bark, and shredded falled leaves, as these are all good mulching materials. Be cautious when using peat moss, as it tends to shed water and splashes the blooms badly during hard rains. Our normal rainfall, from the time that bulbs are planted through their bloom time, typically provides enough moisture for established spring flowering bulbs. Don't be too eager to cut back foliage once all your bulbs have bloomed, because that very foliage is what feeds the bulbs for the bloom period next year. Eventually, all bulbs will become overcrowded and must be divided and replanted. Fortunately, fall is the best time to do this for most of the ones that we've talked about. After flowering, your bulb needs the green leaves to manufacture food. This is known as photosynthesis. And that food is stored in the bulb for next year's growth. Don't remove the foliage too early, because the plant can no longer manufacture nutrient reserves for the next year. This is what results in small, weak bulbs that generally decline and die. There are ways to divert attention from that yellowing bulb foliage. You can interplant bulbs in spring using 1 or 2 colors of annuals. You can place bulbs behind plants on the front edge of a border planting. You can plant taller flowering bulbs behind lower growing foreground shrubs. And you can plant bulbs with ground covers and perennials like hostas or daylilies. There comes a time when you want to think about storing bulbs. Do allow air circulation around stored bulbs. One common method is to place bulbs in a very loose sack and hang in a sheltered, cool area. I have used a bag that lemons come in for this purpose. Most flowering bulbs are best stored over a long period at temperatures between 60 to 65 degrees. The hardest part of this is to keep the humidity in the storage area as low as possible. Bulbs can be stored in a container with peat moss, sand, perlite, or vermiculite. Never store your bulbs more than 2 or 3 layers deep. Those piles of bulbs will generate heat, which generates rot and decay. Never store your bulbs in an area where ethylene gas is produced by fruit. That's what we were talking about earlier about avoiding storing bulbs in the refrigerator, especially with apples. Do not divide or separate your bulbs before storing them. Wait until you're ready to plant them. And if you find any bulbs that appear to be diseased, you will want to discard those. When planting your bulbs that you will be planting, think in terms of some landscape design considerations. Planting bulbs of one variety or color in a mass will have a greater visual impact. It will provide more uniform color and texture that is very pleasing to the eye. Bulbs will also be easier to care for since they will have the same cultural requirements and the foliage will mature at the same time. You'll want to avoid the toy soldier planting. That means don't plant your bulbs in a straight single row or in a single circle around a tree or bush. Plants don't grow in a single straight line in nature. You'll want to think in terms of groupings. Daffodils and tulips plant at least 11 bulbs of one variety in a grouping. 15 is an even better number. The smaller spring bulbs should be planted in groups of 50 bulbs or more in order to have impact. Those smaller bulbs need to be viewed close up, so they should be planted along the sidewalks, the patios, entryways, and planting borders. Some people like to naturalize, which is a process of imitating nature with bulb plantings. The flowers appear in irregular clumps because they're scattered over the landscape. Several early spring bulbs naturalize easy in grassy areas, and these include snowdrops, winter aconites, crocus, squill, and the early blooming daffodils. Do keep in mind that the foliage cannot be mowed off until it dies down naturally, or the bulbs will eventually die out. One technique I like to use is interplanning. The color of spring flowering bulbs is enhanced when it's interplanted with pansies or other compatible early annual flowers. Plants like lilies and dahlias can be interplanted with perennials, annuals, or shrubs to hide the lower area of these tall plants. Daylilies, like the one pictured at the right, are a good choice to hide the lower stems of lilies. When planted in borders, do mix daylilies and daffodils. Also, think about adding ferns or plants that partially hide the foliage, but will still allow it to manufacture the food for the bulb for next year's bloom. Flower heads should be promptly removed in order to prevent the seed production. What if you don't have an area for a bed for your bulbs? No worries. Think about planting in containers. Containers can be moved around and used in different areas of the landscape. So they are an excellent location to plant spring flowering bulbs this fall. Do pay attention to the light requirements of the different bulbs and be sure that any container you use has adequate drainage. You'll want to choose containers that will overwinter. Think in terms of glazed ceramic, a rosin, or a plastic pot that has good longevity and will protect the plants in the winter. Unglazed terracotta will absorb moisture and it may freeze and crack, so it's best to store those for the mild weather use or for annuals. Some people just can't wait for their spring color, and so in the fall they think about forcing their spring bulbs indoors. Bulbs that are forced are those that are made to flower at other than normal times. With proper planting and care, bulbs can supply color for the home from late November until early April, when they usually begin to flower outdoors. When thinking about forcing, think about the steps, such as selecting the most suitable varieties: daffodils, hyacinths, tulips, crocus, and everyone's favorite, the paper white narcissus. Pot the bulbs properly in well-drained potting medium in October or November. Provide a cold temperature treatment if it is required by the bulb. That means 40 degrees for 8 to 12 weeks prior to when you want it to bloom. Bring the bulbs into a cool room in a well-lighted location. Then place the plants in a display location after the blooms are starting to show. When you're forcing your bulbs, you might even think about forcing them in water. Favorites include the narcissus, such as the paper white, because these don't require cold treatment before being forced into bloom. They can even be grown in water with pebbles for support. Hyacinths can be forced to bloom in containers that will support the bulb with only its base touching the water. Before you place them in glasses, do clean the bulbs. The best time for starting bulbs is in October. You'll want to keep glasses containing bulbs in a cool, dark location until the tip growth is 3 to 4 inches long. Think in terms of 45 to 50 degrees. And the flower cluster emerges, free from the bulb. Then you can take it out for display. Remember, this process may take 8 to 12 weeks. When the top growth is well developed, move those glasses to a cool, bright window. Would you like some more information about growing flowering bulbs? Here in Georgia, we have a great extension bulletin, number 918, called Flowering Bulbs for Georgia Gardens. If that is something you're interested in, the web address is on your screen right now. Do you have further questions? Contact your county extension office if you're viewing us from places other than our Walton County, Georgia. In Walton County, our extension office is located in Monroe at 100 North Broad Street. The information and our contact details are on the screen now. We hope you've enjoyed this Gardening with the MGs video. We also hope that it helps you enjoy your own garden. Now let's get digging. Goodbye.